Hello and welcome to the HeatSpring Advanced PV Course Article 310 Conductors for General Wiring. We are going to talk about the evolution of the National Electrical Code. One of the things that happened between 2017 and 2020 is they just changed some of the names of the tables just right when you're getting used to it. In fact, some of the table name changes, they changed them back to what they used to be called. Isn't that kind of crazy? So now we talk about the table formerly known as, what does that remind you of? And that's right, the artist formerly known as Prince is kind of like the table formerly known as 310.15b2a, etc. So as we contemplate these tables throughout contemplating this course, let's just say that these names for our purposes will be interchangeable. So if I say 310.15b2a, that also means 310.15b1. If you wanted to be a total solar nerd, you would get flashcards and memorize all this, but I don't know anybody who is that hardcore, except maybe I'll do that myself. Why not? And why do they do that? Why do they change the names back and forth? They don't change any of the content. Everything is exactly the same. They just change the names. Maybe it's so they can sell more of these NEC books and take your money. That's what it's always all about in a free country where you can make money because you have free markets that are very much not free. 310.15b1 is the ambient temperature correction factor based on 30 degrees C. I want to point out here too that this is called a correction factor. The next thing that we're going to look at is called an adjustment factor. So when we're doing wire sizing, which is coming up a little bit later, we're going to do correction factors and adjustment factors. And let me just say one more thing about wire sizing in case you're getting a little bit anxious, is we're going to have a lot of examples and wire sizing, and we're going to hit that later in the course. If you like working with examples first, go ahead and go over to those wire sizing videos in this course, and you can see the examples right there. But right now, we're going to talk about the basics, because we're going to talk about why we do things before we do them. And why do we do them? Because the NEC and the AHJ says that we have to do them, even though the NEC and the AHJ don't always agree on things. 310.15c1 is the adjustment factor for more than 3 current carrying conductors. And that used to be 310.15b3a. With B3A, I always remember that there's greater than 3 current carrying conductors in conduit. How am I supposed to remember C1? Out of these 2 adjustment and correction factors, we only have B1 and C1. So maybe that'll help us remember that. 310.15b1, 310.15c1. B comes before C. And B is the one that comes first in the book that we always talk about first, and that's for ambient temperature correction factors. And then C1 is for greater than 3 current carrying conductors in conduit. We can look at the bottom of this here too, remove table 310.15b3c, and that was for ambient temperature adjustment for raceways or cables exposed to sunlight over rooftops. And that was only relevant for 2014 NEC and earlier. However, 2017 NEC and beyond, if we do put conduit within 7/8 of an inch of the roof, we still have to add 33 degrees to the ambient temperature. However, nobody should be that silly, I was going to say stupid, as to mount your raceway that close to the roof, because you're going to have other problems. You're not going to have good flow for the leaves and things. You're going to have things build up and make squirrel nests and birds' nests and invite the pigeons over. Great place to do nests. I always put my nests where there's conduit that's less than 7/8 of an inch from a roof. So don't do that. But if you did do that, you would still have to add a temperature. But there's no table. There's no 310.15b3c. So we pretty much don't use that. And then the next ones, these used to be called this a long time ago, 310.16 and 310.17, not really that long ago. 10 years ago, I think we were calling them these. Now we call them 310.16 and 310.17 again. So 310.16 is, I abbreviate this one, ampacities in raceway or cable on Earth. And that's pretty much everything but free air. So if you have your cables in free air, that's 310.17, formerly known as 310.15b17, which is ampacities of single insulated conductors in free air. So that's pretty much your PV wire behind the modules right there. That's how we know that. And if you looked up and you saw a service drop coming to your house, that would theoretically have to follow this table, except, you know what? Utilities do not have to follow the NEC. They have their own set of rules. They typically read the NESC, National Electrical Safety Code. So everything but free air, 310.16, probably the most popular page in the whole NEC. And then when you're talking free air, that's 310.17. So let's just remember these things because we're here to memorize, and I just think it's so confusing to change the table names, and I need to do this myself. 310.15b1 is ambient temperature correction factor based on 30C. 310.15c1, adjustment factors for more than 3 current carrying conductors. And it's, if you already knew 310.15b16 and 310.15b17, it's kind of easy to memorize because it's just 16 and 17 again. But we got rid of the 15b. That's it. Just get rid of the 15b, throw it out, get rid of it, throw it in the trash. Okay, close your eyes. What is ambient temperature correction factors based on 30 degrees C in the 2020 NEC? That's right, it's 310.15b1. What is adjustment factors for more than 3 current carrying conductors in the 2020 NEC? Your eyes are still closed, right? That's 310.15c1. And 310.15b16 and b17, kind of easy. You just throw out the 15b. You are now officially smart. Article 310, conductors for general wiring. This is where we're going to go when we want to figure out how big our wire needs to be. That's the main part of 310, and that's why 310 is probably the most popular place in the code for electricians to be. Looking through 310, figuring out how big does this wire have to be. There's lots of different reasons why a wire should be larger and smaller, and sometimes we're looking at Article 240 when we're sizing a wire, 250 when we're sizing a wire. So remember 240 overcurrent protection, 250 grounding and bonding, and 310 is just our general wiring, how big that wire's got to be. But of course, there's other places in the code book that we have to look, even in Article 690, where we talk about solar. So once again, we will call these correction factors and these adjustment factors, sometimes we throw them in the same category and we call them conditions of use. So when we're doing wire sizing, when we say conditions of use, we're referring to these two tables, 310.15b1, the table formerly known as 310.15b2a, and 310.15c1, the table formerly known as 310.15b3a. Now let's take a look at the rest of these pages in the National Electrical Code, and we can see that 310 isn't super long, so let's kind of just scroll through this and get a feel for what we're dealing with. And we're not up to things that we even use a lot. And that's one of the things about the NEC too, is there's a lot of pages that you don't use, and kind of the more important thing is knowing what not to use. It's kind of important to figure that out because people get in trouble by using the pages that were not meant to be used. So here we go, we're up to 310, so we'll go 310.10. It's good thing to do is to read this. And I also have the NEC handbook next to me. However, they don't give me a digital version for the 2020 NEC. And I do see different explanations that get a little bit deeper into it. And so if you have the money, hey, you can get both. Plus, it's a good workout. It's like using barbells. You can strengthen your shoulder, your deltoids, things like that, carrying it around. We're not to the key parts yet. Also here, engineering supervision. If you're an engineer, you can just do the math and know about the characteristics of copper itself and how it carries electricity. So here we go, 310.15. It says ampacity tables. One of the things that's kind of weird with that is now they changed it to 310.16 and 17, which used to be 310.15b16 and 310.15b17. So it's not really even in tables if it's called 310.16. Oh, there we go. There's some information about how metal works for engineers when you're doing complicated math. So here it is, 310.15b1, ambient temperature correction factors based on 30 degrees C. So that means if you're at 30 degrees C, you don't need to do any correction factor. But once you get hotter than 30 C, then you're going to have to start derating things. So we could see there's the 90C column. Typically in the solar industry, we are using 90C rated wire. And so if you're in a place where it gets super hot, you say it gets to be 40 degrees. One of the places that you would get these temperatures from is the Solar ABC's website, and I've already showed you that, and it was funded by a DOE grant. The grant doesn't go, so it's a little bit out of date, but it doesn't really matter. And here we can see at 40 degrees, which is hot, 104 degrees, it's a 0.91D rating. So that means that your wire can carry 91% of the ampacity it otherwise could have. So if it could carry 100 amps, then now it can only carry 91 amps when it gets to be between 36 and 40 degrees. I don't know why they go up to these super high temperatures, because nowhere on the planet Earth do you have some kind of surface temperature that's that hot. Perhaps for people designing systems inside of saunas. Let's go to a sauna and design a PV system. Okay, here's kind of important table to know not to use. This is the one that's based on 40 degrees C. Toss it, man. This table confuses people. I've never met anybody that actually used this table. A lot of electricians in their training, they learn to go here and put a big X through this page. But I don't know if you can do that, but just don't use that page when we want to use stuff that's based on 30 degrees C. And that would be more like room temperature. So in a building, typically 30 degrees C. And so a lot of times somebody that's wiring a house doesn't have to use these tables. When you're doing stuff inside, you don't have to use these tables unless you're working in a sauna. Then that's a good place to study too, is in a sauna under adverse conditions. But then you're supposed to study in the same condition. You take a test. I don't know how you're going to take a test in a sauna, so you better get one of those big North Face super down jackets like I did when you go take your test. And they'll go, that guy's crazy. He's all sweating in a big old jacket. Why pay for a sauna when you could just get a jacket like that? And here we have some talk about these tables too. And so I recommend to read this too. It's going to tell you some different things that we're going to go over also a little bit later in this course. We're just kind of scrolling through here, and we're going to cover some of this stuff again, because you know what? That's how you learn stuff. Repetition. There it goes. 310-15C1. That's an important table. And so this is for the adjustment factor for greater than 3 current carrying conductors. It kind of works well with 3-phase. So if you have one set of 3-phase, you don't have to derate. 2 set of 3-phase, 2 times 3 is 6. You derate to 80%. 3 set of 3-phase, 3 times 3 is 9. Then you derate it 70%. And then we go up here, and you can see if you put a whole bunch of conductors and conduit, like maybe a bunch of PV source circuits, and also you would have to go greater than 24 inches, all of a sudden you are derating by this huge factor, and you could only carry 35% of your current. And so that is kind of nuts to be putting that many conductors in conduit unless you really oversized your wire. So another reason why people that are designing wires another reason why people that are designing PV systems look at things like this and they say, should I use smaller conductors, or should I use smaller conductors, or should I combine things together and use larger conductors so I don't have to deal with this table? Or another way not to have to deal with this table is to use multiple conduits. And a benefit of using multiple conduits is it's easier to work with smaller conduits. You don't have to have these big conduit benders that are not powered by muscle. You have to get something that is mechanically powered to bend big enough conduit. And another thing is if you bring all your conductors further along, then you can check different things and turn things off, say downstairs or closer to an inverter. If you're on the DC side, or if you're on the AC side, just closer to where your power is going if you're using smaller conductors. And I'm not saying one way or the other. There's different reasons why people would go one way or the other. Perhaps too, another reason would be to have a whole bunch of small conductors is a little bit more expensive as far as your copper goes than to have less larger conductors. Just different things to look at. Lots of different factors in there though. DC side, or if you're on the AC side, just closer to where your power is going if you're using smaller conductors. And I'm not saying one way or the other. There's different reasons why people would go one way or the other. Perhaps too, another reason would be to have a whole bunch of small conductors is a little bit more expensive as far as your copper goes than to have less larger conductors. Just different things to look at. Lots of different factors in there though. Here is an example of multiple conduits instead of one big conduit. So if he just had a couple of wires, like 3 conductors in each conduit, he did not have to do as much derating than if he took a bigger conduit and jammed a whole bunch of conductors in a single conduit. Then he would have had to do different derating. Then he would have had to use more copper and derated the wire differently. So he used smaller conduits, easier to work with for his size of a business. However, some people will do it the other way too. Just while we're looking at this picture, these are S5 clamps here, and these S5 clamps are clamped onto this metal roof, and that's called a standing seam metal roof. Each one of these is called a panel, and that's a roofing panel, and there's a separate roofing panel and a separate roofing panel that's crimped together. So they come up with a trailer. I used to work at a high-end roofing company, and they had a $50,000 trailer. By now, it's probably a $100,000 trailer. And they would have rolls of sheet metal, and they would just make one of these on site, however long they wanted it. And then they would clamp these things together. And they also can put the S5 clamps on these. And it's the easiest way to install a solar system. You just clamp it right onto the seam. You can check these guys out too. They're pretty cool. They're some Colorado cowboys. You'll see them at the solar trade shows, the guys with the big old cowboy hats. They're so cool, and it's a father and sons team. And the father is so smart, he named one of his kids Sean. And here we have 310.16. I'm just going to read the whole title. Ampacities of insulated conductors with not more than 3 current carrying conductors in raceway, cable, or earth directly buried. And so that's not all these directly buried. This is pretty much for everything except for free air. So I like to call this table the table for everything except for free air. This is the most commonly used table in the NEC. And we can see there's real small wires, number 18, not too many people using that. And then we can see the wires get bigger and bigger. Once we get bigger than 1, we have 1/0. Then once you get bigger than 4/0, we talk about thousands of circular mills, KC mills. A circular mill is the area of a circle with a diameter of 1/1000th of an inch. That's a circular mill. And who knows why they came up with something so difficult to deal with? The people in the rest of the world, they do things simpler, but maybe since they do things simpler, like the metric system, they don't have as many neuronal connections in their brain. And that's why America's number one. That's why everybody in America is so smart, because they do things in a more difficult way, like have these wire sizes that don't make sense, whereas the rest of the world, they just talk about square millimeters. It's like, oh, cross-sectional area, square millimeters. That makes sense. American wire gauge, the bigger the number, the smaller the wire, and then you have these aughts, and then you have thousands of circular mills. That makes things more difficult, so you have to think harder, and you probably have to study harder too. It's unfortunate, but that's just the way that it is. Here are these different wires, and they don't have all the wires, but they have examples of 90C rated wires. So there we go, USE2. You can see that PV wire isn't here, but you would just use this column if you're using PV wire. You can see the other type of common wire that we use inside a conduit, THWN2. That's right there. So we use that all the time. And there is just some other wires that we can use right here. Oh, there's another one too we're going to talk a little bit, RHW-2. So now your USE2 wire, it almost always is dual rated as RHW-2, but now it's required to be. It would be hard to find USE-2 wire that isn't dual rated as RHW-2, but if you were unlucky and you found that, then you couldn't use it. Now, according to the 2020 NEC, in the 2017 NEC, you could, 2020 NEC, you can't. And I know that this course is covering different levels of the NEC. I know a lot of people want to just pass the NABCEP exam, and for that purpose, the NABCEP guys, they're not trying to trick you, but there's different versions of the NEC being used throughout the country. We talked about that when we were talking about the oldest that I could find was Aurora, Illinois. Remember, home of Wayne's World. Other things here are 75 degree C rated wire. A lot of times we use this column when we're doing wire sizing because we do a check for terminals. And when you do the terminal check, we're using this column. So sometimes this column decides things, sometimes this column decides things. When we get into wire sizing, we're going to see that when we're doing the terminal check, we don't take into consideration the adjustment correction factors, also known as conditions of use. And when we're using the wire ampacity, we don't correct for continuous current, but we do take into consideration the adjustment and the correction factors. Woo! A lot of information there. Aluminum or copper clad aluminum, mostly we don't see copper clad aluminum, but for aluminum wires, you can't take as much current, and you just have to be more careful because aluminum oxidizes when it gets exposed to oxygen. So if you're on one of those planets that has oxygen, which is a byproduct of photosynthesis, then you have to worry about aluminum oxidizing because aluminum itself is a great conductor. Aluminum oxide is not a good conductor, and you have to prepare your aluminum wire with some sort of sandpaper and an antioxidant like Nolox. Next, we have Table 310.17, the table formerly known as 310.15b17, and that is ampacities of single insulated conductors in free air. And so pretty much what that means is these conductors are just sitting out there in the free air with wind blowing by them, and pretty much they can handle more current. And so we can see that a number 10 wire that is 90C rated in free air can take 55 amps. But if I went back to that last table, if we're not hanging out there in free air, then we could only handle 40 amps because we don't have that wind blowing by on 310.16 that we would have on 310.17. And pretty much everything here is just the same, but it's what you would use if you had conductors that are not in conduit, and we'd pretty much see that in the solar industry when we have our conductors behind the modules. There are some other tables here too. And so with alternating current, sometimes when you're doing huge, giant, big, old utility scale systems, there's other things to take into consideration, and you pretty much need to be an engineer to do this. So when you're doing things under engineering supervision, the engineer will use some of these other tables. We're talking about these different types of factors. So you know what? Why don't you go to engineering school? There you go. Once you finish this class, you're ready, right? And let's finish off Article 310 by this kind of a joke. Ampacities of bare or covered conductors in free air. Who's going to use a bare conductor? Are we still talking knob and tube? That's crazy. Let's talk about the theory here, and we're going to talk about how this works. There's a temperature rating of the insulation, and then there's a certain amount of metal, typically copper, stranded or could be solid if it's a smaller wire. And let's first talk about the conditions of use, which are conditions that decrease the ampacity of a conductor due to heat. And so that means that if we have a conductor that's got insulation around a piece of wire and we put that in a hot place, what's going to do is it's going to heat up more. So remember, current going through a wire, not voltage, but current going through a wire creates heat. And if we have that wire in a hot place, it won't be able to take as much heat before it gets so hot that it could be a danger, because the insulation that goes around a conductor is only made to get so hot. And if it gets hotter than that repeated times and so on and so forth, plus there's a little bit of room in there for error because we like to be extra safe. They say that the code, the NEC, is actually safer than the international codes. So we have a little cushion in there for safety. And so we want to make sure that our wires don't heat up too much. If our wires did heat up too much, they could be a fire hazard. And remember, the NEC is published by the National Fire Protection Association, NFPA, and their whole deal is not about efficiency, it's about safety. And we are going to be safe when we install these PV systems, because if we're not safe, then that'll give photovoltaics a bad name. And we don't want that. We have enough trouble, taking on all these coal and fossil fuel industries with renewable energy. Okay. Let's take a look at the earlier parts of 310, and we're looking at 310.10 right now. And there's different categories for uses permitted for these conductors. One of the categories is going to be for like dry locations, or we can look at dry and damp locations, or wet locations, or even locations exposed to direct sunlight. If we want to research more and look at the details about all these different types of conductors, such as THWN-2, which is super popular for solar people, one of the things that, like if you see a W in the name of the wire, like THWN, that means for water. If you see a -2, that means it can get up to 90 degrees C. Or if you see HH, that could get to be 90 degrees C. If you see a T, that means thermoplastic. If you see a single H, possibly only 75 degrees C. So those are some good indicators of what you're dealing with. 310.10G, we're going to talk a little bit about conductors and parallel. And this is for when you have a lot of current and it's too difficult to work with a wire that would be so huge that you need a couple of wires to carry that same current instead of using a gigantic wire. In a lot of cases, you probably don't want to have a parallel connector, but sometimes it's too hard to work with a wire that's too big. It's harder to bend and move and put terminals on. And another reason is with alternating current, there is something called the skin effect. And so when you get to large amounts of power going across a wire, you start worrying about the skin effect. And that's all about electrons trying to flow on the outer part of the conductor instead of the middle part. And one of the things that you might even notice when you're driving down the road is you see these big old utility towers, and a lot of times they have parallel circuits on there. So you'll see those circuits with the big ones up there is typically 3-phase and groups of 3, and you might see like parallel conductors, so extra groups of 3. And that would be because they are dealing with the skin effect for one thing. And so some of the things, like if we want to run conductors parallel, we can't just do that with a little small wire. We can't go like, oh, instead of upsizing my wire, I'll just use 2 of them. But what we're going to be doing that is with conductors that are 1/aught AWG. So that's kind of a big wire and larger. And then also what we would have to do is make sure that the conductors are the same length. So if I have 2 conductors going from one place to another place, I can't make one twice as long as the other. They need to be the same length. So that would lead to the same amount of resistance because they're also the same size, the same diameter. And so if we have a conductor that's the same length and the same size and the same material, talking copper, what's going to happen is there's going to be the same amount of resistance in each conductor. So we're not going to have like most of the current trying to go one way or the other. We have them equal. When we're going parallel, we want them to be equal amount of resistance, equal amount of voltage drop. And so also the same insulation type, we want to see identical wires, and we want to see them terminated in the same manner. And that's another thing that has to do with resistance, because if you have one thing terminated one way and another thing terminated another way, different terminations are going to have different resistances. And so we want everything to be exactly the same. And this especially goes if you're going to be working with battery banks. With battery banks, sometimes they put the batteries in parallel. And when the conductors are going in parallel with a battery bank, what will happen is if they are not in the strings of batteries too, the different series connected batteries, if you don't have the same amount of resistance with each string of batteries and the conductors being the same length, the same material, the same size, and so forth, what you're going to end up with is one string of batteries, one series connected group of batteries is going to have more resistance than the other. And the string of batteries that has more resistance isn't going to be used as much, and the batteries will get worn out unevenly. And that's not a good thing because batteries are expensive and we don't want those batteries to get worn out unevenly. And so what we do, we work very hard at minimizing our number of parallel connections with battery banks, but also not having multiple strings if we can avoid it. And so when we talk more about batteries later, we're going to be learning about why it's better to have a single string of batteries and why 2-volt lead acid batteries are a lot more popular than 12-volt lead acid batteries for large battery systems. Because if you were going to have a 48-volt system, you could go 4 12-volt batteries, or you could go 24 2-volt batteries. And if all the batteries were the same size, then you're going to get a lot more power out of a single string with 2-volt lead acid batteries. Let's talk about something interesting and take an interesting intermission after something interesting because I don't want my videos to get too long. So we were talking about batteries, and so Article 480 is storage batteries. Let's talk a little bit about energy storage systems. So right here I have the installation manual for a popular battery. It's an LG RESU, Residential Energy Storage Unit. We could see the dimensions right there, and it's something that you can mount on your wall. This is also something that you don't ever look at the batteries. You don't touch the batteries. It's a bit different than a lead acid battery. A lead acid battery, you touch the batteries, you see the terminals, you worry about short circuits. This thing, it's got electronics built into it. This thing, it talks to the internet. They can update the firmware through the internet. This thing is smarter than some of my friends. Now we could see some of the characteristics of this device. And so even though it was a 9.8 kilowatt hour battery, you can only use 9.3 kilowatt hours because they're not going to cycle it down that far. This particular one that we're looking at also is what some people would consider a high voltage battery. So we could see it goes up to 450 volts here. It goes down to 350 volts as it's operating, charging and discharging. However, the absolute maximum voltage, which I would use for my maximum voltage ever, if I was doing a calculation for this energy storage system, would be 520 volts. We could also see our currents right here. So we go down at our lower current at 420 volts would be 11.9 amps. And our upper current at 350 volts is 14.3 amps. So you remember, you have to size it based on the lower voltage. That is something that we look at when we're looking at the National Electrical Code. You base it on your lower voltage is going to be your higher current, because voltage times current is power. And while I was pausing it right there, I pulled out my calculator and I multiplied 14.3 times 350. Then I multiplied 11.9 amps times 420. And both times I got very close to 5 kilowatts. And that's what that's all about. That would be a 5 kilowatt battery right there, because that's how much it could put out. And that's what it says right there, 5 kilowatts. What a coincidence. But for 10 seconds, it can put out 7 kilowatts. So we have that right there. That's pretty typical for things that work off grid, is they can, for short periods of time, they could give you some surge currents that could surge up to 7 kilowatts for 10 seconds. However, you don't size your wires based on the surge. You're going to size your wires based on the continuous power and the continuous current right there. That's one way it can communicate. RS-485, it's got a DC disconnect built into it. It works inside and outside under all kinds of different temperatures and humidities, up to 2,000 meters, which is 6,562 feet. One of the reasons that things don't work when you get too high up there in the sky is because the air is thinner and it takes a little bit more to cool it off. I imagine they could probably reset something so it didn't put out 5 kilowatts. They could make it a 4 kilowatt battery, and then it would work on Mount Everest perhaps. Here's the UL certifications they have for this one. UL 1642 and UL 1973. This also is a DC energy storage system. If you looked at the Powerwall 2, which their competitor Tesla is putting out, that one's got an inverter built into it, and so that would be an AC energy storage system. But we will save that for another interesting thing, because it is time to pop the popcorn and get on with your intermission, your interesting intermission.